we could, because it's, apart from anything else, it's fun. And, you know, sometimes we forget this. We get a little bit earnest about cycling, and, you know, having the wind in your hair and sort of whizzing along is just makes you feel good to be alive, apart from anything else, apart from often being the quickest way to get from A to B, and good for you physically and mentally. But anyway, just come to the subject of today's meeting, the role of national highways. Of difficulty keeping up with your frequent change of name, Frida. Still remember you as the Highways Agency, then Highways England, but now National Highways. And certainly in my area, you know, you've got a fantastic new road recently, the A5M1 link that had no cycleway next to it. But I am pleased that the A6 M1 link will have a cycleway next to it. So progress, that's good. But we want to make sure, you know, we really secure this progress. So Frida, I'm going to pose a couple of questions to you, which I wonder if you could very kindly respond to in your remarks, if that's all right. And these questions were collated, drawn together really by our Conservative Friends of Cycling members. So the first thing I'd like to ask you, Frida, you know, three questions, if you could respond to in your remarks, please. So the first one is, what are you doing at National Highways to make sure that all your schemes, you know, fully meet the aspirations of gear change, which is a government document, and specifically comply with LTN 1/20? So that's really my first question. And you know, Frida, I hope that's making sure, you know, cycle routes are physically segregated, they don't give up difficult places, routes join together. You know, an isolated stretch on its own isn't much of a help, and you should, you know, we really want you to try and you know, not have too many barriers or chicanes and dismount signs and so on. So that's my first question. Secondly, you know, what are you doing to make sure that the funding you have for delivering gear change is really integral to the schemes that you are working on, reflecting LTN 120, and is not just a nice to have add-on, you know, to pay sort of lip service to LTN 120. And then just finally, you know, practical question arising out of those two: do you have enough sort of experienced staff, you know, who are cyclists themselves and actually really understand what cycle infrastructure needs? And I do note that on page 21 of Gear Change, it says routes should only be designed by those who have experienced the road on a bicycle, which is a really good point. You know, you cannot do this from a desk or a map or a, you know, set of plans on a computer screen. So Frida, sorry, I didn't give you advance warning of those, but I'm sure you are all over your brief and will be able to respond positively to those 3 points, if you're able to, please. Thank you so much.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to do a short presentation which will cover at least some of those points, and then if there are any gaps, I'll definitely, which certainly with the last one I probably haven't covered it, but I can answer that at the end as well. If you just bear with me, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully. Can you see it, is the first question? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through the first few, because I'm assuming from what you've said, you all have some knowledge of National Highways, Highways England, Highways Agency. And I should say that I've been part of Highways Agency, Highways England, and now National Highways for 21 years. And before that was in local government for 10 years. So I do have and worked across parts of the organisation. So I do have quite a good knowledge of how policy, for example, gets implemented in various ways, whether it be actually on the ground or indeed policy, which is more my area now. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to whiz through the boring stuff, but it's important to get the context, I guess. So 4,300 miles of motorway. Perhaps the omission there is how many cycleways, for example, we've got, and I'll come on to that as well, because it's difficult to know in some cases. We do have a sense now of how many crossings we've got. It's in the hundreds, but we need to build our asset knowledge a little bit better, it's fair to say. Sorry. You know that we're a GoCo. We operate the network as well as build stuff. It's also important to know that a huge proportion of the country uses our network, including 70% of all freight, which is actually another area of mine. So very broad spectrum of needs that we address, I guess. We care very much about our communities, not just our roads that we operate and build and improve. We care about the communities that run alongside our network and are impacted by our network, And obviously with net zero being at the forefront, we play a full part in the government's policy to reduce carbon, okay, and indeed other areas of environmental challenges. Okay, so I'm going to skip past the next few slides. They're just some of our focuses, but fair to say that safety is top of our list. Safety is absolutely key to every single thing that we do. And we've made great strides in reducing killed and seriously injured motorists, I should say. So, customer. This is where walker, cycling, horse riding, or pedestrians, equestrianism, depending on your language, and I'm just going to skip those, as I said, and get on to the bit that you really want to hear about. Right, so in RIS1, which is the first period that Highways England existed, from 2015 to 2020, we had £15 billion of investment. And then in RIS2, that almost doubled to 27.4. So we've got an enormous programme of improvements to deliver. Majority of those are big schemes, but also improvements in our smaller schemes and how we operate and maintain the network. Okay, so that sets the context. Now here are the slides I really wanted to talk about. So in terms of funding, the opportunities, I really wanted to focus on designated funds because there is a huge opportunity around designated funds, and that is a separate pot of money that we manage to look at a number of areas. And one of those areas is users and communities. Hopefully you can see. So the 4 areas of funding, one of my screen is slightly blocked out there, but you can see there users and communities as a key fund plan. And that's absolutely essential. And that didn't exist in RIS1, in Roads Period 1. And there's a great opportunity in there for all sorts of areas around our customers. And that might be freight, it might be facilities, roadside facilities, obviously very current at the moment, but it also absolutely covers walkers, cyclists and horse riders. And that has made it a lot easier for us to complement what our major schemes are already doing, and there is a requirement that our major schemes consider and implement facilities for walkers, cyclists and horse riders in their major schemes. But it may be that working with local authorities that we identify things that are outside major schemes, or I think you mentioned the A5, for example. There may be opportunities to retrofit areas that weren't governed and didn't have the ability to use designated funds when they were being constructed. So there's some really good news stories there. You can see there integration is also key. You mentioned remoding. My team also looks after retiming of journeys, reducing journeys, as you mentioned, remoding of journeys, and all of that cannot be done unless we are working hand in hand with our local government colleagues. Walkers, cyclists and horse riders absolutely want more provision there, better crossings, more joined up crossings and safer routes. And there's some real challenges around there because some of the routes aren't heavily used, so it's quite difficult to justify an improvement. But of course, they might not be heavily used because they're in a poor state of repair or they're unattractive for other reasons. But we're on top of that, we hope, and we're recognising that might be the case, and we're working closely with stakeholders, including local government, to try and address some of those issues. You will also probably know that Transport Focus is our watchdog, and they have undertaken surveys. I think they've done 3 surveys now, 1 general one and 2 or 3 specific ones, specific to regions. And we've taken on board their comments and are working with them as well to address some of the specifics that they have identified. Okay. So just a couple of little good news stories there. So the Keswick Trail is something, I think it's near the A590 up in Cumbria. We've done a lot of work in that space. And a little bit more about designated funds and the sort of schemes that we're looking for. So as I mentioned, existing crossings, new dedicated lanes or signage or lighting, all the things that Transport Focus identified in their reports. Not rocket science, I know, but it's good to get some specifics that we can focus on. Customer service plan, we have a strategy and we have a plan, and I just wanted to highlight the next slide. Just a little bit of work we're doing this year. So we've got some 2 pilots with local authorities underway or shortly underway, which is looking at severed public rights of way. So we did some research last year to identify some of the severance issues, and now we're looking at how we might develop some interventions to solve those issues. And once we've done that, we'll then work with them and designated funds to actually fund an improvement in that space. So I'm quite excited about that. That's looking good. And then answering some of the questions I get. So we've got a lot of challenge about how do we work with stakeholders. And, you know, there are lots of case studies. I've been talking to the regions over the last month because it's picking up some of this work area. And there's some great stuff going on. And some of it depends on how mature and developed the local authorities are, and some of it doesn't, and we can encourage those conversations. So certainly in the Southwest, the Midlands and the Northeast, we've got some great examples of how we're looking at the strategic approach required by the local plans, which we don't have to develop, but we're working with our local authorities to where they've identified needs near our network or affecting or impacting our network, or our network is impacting them, we can come up with some solutions. So that's going really well, actually, and there's some really good case studies. And then, as I said before, we'll use designated funds. You know, designated funds are not just for highways, national highways. Designated funds are also for joint applications from the private sector, from local government. In fact, they're more likely to get approved if they're co-funded with our partners. So some real opportunities around designated funds. Just want to touch on design standards. Andrew, you mentioned LTN 120. It's really important to know that LTN 120 has some really good stuff in it, frankly, but it is guidance for local authorities, and we believe that our 3 standards, which have been in place for some time now, they're on the screen there, actually cover those requirements. So we're not saying we don't work to local Transport Note 120, but what we are saying is that we have our own standards that we, our contractors and designers are mandated to use. It is also the case that where a significant part of the improvement that we're doing is actually on the local authority network, then of course we would take LTN 120 into account. But it's just important to know that slight nuance there with regard to standards and what's relevant for us and what's relevant for local authorities. But I look at them all together, if I'm honest, and I'd encourage our projects to do similar, and I know that they do. And we can come back to that if you like. So then in terms of monitoring customer insight and satisfaction, I mentioned at the start that perhaps we need to improve in understanding our asset knowledge. We've got great asset knowledge in terms of understanding at regional and area level what we've got, but at a national level, perhaps we could do better. In terms of evaluating some of our schemes that we've already done, I think we've got up, several hundred crossings that we've improved. What we now need to do is sort of take a step back and look at it in the round and really see where are the priorities now. We've made great progress in roads period 1. Where do we actually need to really make a difference now that we've done those first suite of improvements? And the insight surveys from Transport Focus, and indeed our own insight surveys, we've got behavioural science team, they are helping us understand where the priorities are. And the designated funds process will absolutely need all of this information to justify schemes. Okay, so that was a very quick whiz through. I appreciate it was quite fast. I'm just going back to your questions. So LTM 120, how do we join together? And you mentioned segregation there as well. Well, I think we've got a really good regional buy-in and working together with local authorities. There's some great evidence of that. In terms of segregation, that wasn't actually part of our the 3 standards I mentioned that we use, but it is now, because we refreshed our standards in the last 2 years, and segregation is absolutely an option within that, and where possible we would look to do that. In terms of funding being integral to schemes, absolutely. It's mandated in our standards that any schemes now have to consider walkers, cyclists and horse riders. Some of our previous advice, which dates back to some of it's as old as 1993, you can imagine a large scheme takes years and years of planning, so you have to draw the line somewhere with regard to what standards they use when they're designing a scheme. So any schemes that are in design now or in the last 2 years will be mandated to work with stakeholders using insight and build in that requirement where they can. And I found your last question really, really interesting. Do we have enough experienced staff? And do we understand what cyclists' needs are in particular? Well, just judging from the passion that I've seen within the regions and the way they're interacting with the local authorities, I would say absolutely yes. We have one of my teams is all about modal shift and demand management and active travel. It's in the title of the team. So from a specialist knowledge, we have a lot of commitment there as well. And most of us certainly are cyclists as well. Some of us are horse riders, and we all walk. So we all use our network, as you say. Well, most of us are drivers, but we also are passionate about reducing the need to use the car. So from what I've seen around the regions, I think the answer is yes. Okay, so does that answer your 3 questions, or what else would you like me to respond to?
Hi, Frida. Thank you very much for the presentation and for starting to answer the questions. There was a question from Martin Bolt. You're the custodian of former rail corridors, and certainly we've picked this up on Transport Committee, that Highways England bizarrely has been given responsibility for structures, rail structures, either road bridges over former rail paths or rail bridges going over roads. And there's a lot of concern that these potential routes, either for cycling and walking in future, or even possibly reopening rail lines, you're going for the most expensive option, which is to block in the bridges. If you take that photo you showed earlier of the two cyclists on that wooded path with the bridge behind them, Highways England is concreting in that bridge arch, well, not that bridge arch, but bridge arches like that, when there's a far cheaper solution if indeed those structures are at risk, because it'll cost a fortune or be virtually impossible to reopen those structures as and when in the future that there is an opportunity to use the rail, the former rail path as either an active travel route or as a rail route, and growing anger about this. So what is happening? Is there a rethink?
So I know exactly which case you're referring to. I know of one.
Several cases. There's several cases all around.
I know absolutely of one. It was in the press. So we have been tasked to look after the historic railway estate.
Yeah.
And by carrying out, no, I'm not going to use the word improvement, by carrying out works to those structures, that will have been decided for a structural reason. So those bridges that have been infilled, there would have been structural reasons behind that. But as I said, I can't answer the specifics today, but I could go away and look at them on the structures that have been affected. Our standards clearly say, regardless of your project, you have to consider all the options with regard to walkers, cyclists and horse riders. We mandate ourselves and our supply chain, our designers that we use, that they have to do that. So I would have to go away and check whether they did that from an assurance point of view. I would hope that they did, and there was some overarching structural reason why this has happened. So I can't really say more than that, apart from I'm happy to go away and check that.
Yeah, okay. It just, I mean, obviously it's not in your departmental area, but I mean, this is the APPG cycling and walking. So I would ask you to go back to this, because it isn't one case. It was a blanket decision by Highways England to demolish or infill hundreds of bridges and tunnels and send out a blanket permitted development, I think it was, or standard application to local authorities, many of which sort of didn't actually notice it, and it went under the radar. And I think there's at least one been concreted in fully so far. And how that bridge will ever be, that bridge arch could ever be opened up again, I don't know. But we've seen figures that show that it's a lot cheaper to support, if indeed that structure is weak, to support it some other way. Or the other thing is if a rail route is going over a road, but the rail route isn't currently used, that rail bridge over a road is being demolished. Again, huge cost to replace it one day in the future, when rather than supporting it from underneath somehow, in a way to keep both routes open. And as I say, this was a blanket decision, which is taking time to unravel, and it goes against what Highways England said they were doing in terms of cycling walking, because certainly there was some, as you've mentioned, policies, and you are improving standards on routes along highway, major highways and across them. Both are hugely important. But then to have this on these very minor side roads in an area which isn't the agency's expertise anyway, because we tend to be talking about farm tracks or tiny rural roads.
I have a great deal of personal sympathy, and I certainly knew of one. I wasn't actually aware of the blanket decision, but I will go away and talk to the teams and make sure that, I'll find out the facts.
Well, we've been raising this with, Transport Committee has been raising this with Chris Heaton Harris, the Minister, and with Grant Shapps. I know that other groups have done so as well. But if you Google infill 24, there's one that comes out: historic railway structures facing demolition or infilling. Highways England locked in yet another bridge infilling row. Victorian railway heritage at risk from plan to fill in. So this is a systematic policy decision, and it needs reversing.
Okay, I will seek to find out the background at the very least.
It's as I say, it's a bit of the transport network in this country that is not your core business, your organisation's core business.
No, it isn't.
And it got, and yet it's causing huge future-proofing problems for future walking and cycling routes, and even current sort of in plan being thought about walking and cycling routes with community organisations and with local authorities, or historic rail organisations, even potentially reopening branch lines in future.
I understand.
Right. Right. Adam, I hope you're sort of moving into answer those that have been answered. Right.
Can I just jump in there?
Yes, go on, Darren. Thank you.
Just on LTN 120. I know that you've said you've got your national highways, 3 standards that you use, but just from my point of view, with the Towns deal, for example, we're looking at putting in a cycle superhighway, and they'll be expecting us in the bid to meet the standards of LTN 120. Now, is that a realistic thing? Because we're really concerned that if we don't have it so that it meets that design standard, maybe we won't get the bid, and we're sort of concerned about that. But there needs to be an element of realism, and is that something maybe we need to take to the ministers, that there needs to be an element of realism in that? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, LTN 20 is worded in a way that frankly says that you comply with this in order to get funding. So you're
exactly
correct.
Yeah.
However, I'm sure I saw something in it that does provide a little bit more balance, that you go as far as you can realistically, from a business case point of view. Our standards, if you add them all together, aren't that far off LTN 120, and our just speaking about our standards for a minute, we review our standards fairly regularly. Certainly they'll be due for review within the next couple of years, and one of the commitments we'll make will be to try and tie them together a little bit more with LTN 20. So we recognise the importance of LTN 20, but it is challenging. I would argue it wouldn't necessarily, if you don't meet all the requirements, I think it depends what they are, of course. It's hard for me to say without looking at the detail, but the more you can meet, the better, more likelihood you are to get funding, I guess. Yeah, certainly worded that way.
Thank you. Are we going to take some questions from the Q&A?
Yeah. Let me ask Chris Howell's question. He's the co-chair, or she, don't know, co-chair of Conservative Friends of Cycling. Designated funds are limited pots with contention between calls on them. Given the government's commitments on climate change and modal shift, shouldn't national highways now see cycling and walking as a key to road schemes and be provided with sufficient core funding to build quality networks, so that new roads help cyclists cross existing barriers like rivers and railways and don't create new barriers, and basically be designed in from the beginning rather than be added as an afterthought, which is so often the case? Is national highways incentivized in the same way that local authorities now are, following the COVID changes last year, modal shift, to really integrate? Because in a way, national highways went ahead of a local, national support for local roads, but is there now an issue about catch-up and consistency long term rather than stop-start?
I guess some of this is around assurance from my point of view. So, and that's the piece of work we're just starting to do, really. So our standards mandate that our schemes have to consider and build in requirements for walkers, cyclists, horse riding. They absolutely say that. And there'd have to be something called a departure from standard. There'd have to be a very good reason why they couldn't do that. And that would include crossings, for example, and not, you know, sorry, where I was talking about the work with public rights of way severance, so no severance issues, I suppose that's what I was trying to say. And that's mandated in our standards. So I guess some of the schemes that you're seeing come through now, those design standards weren't in place when they started being designed. It's not it's just a fact. Schemes, large schemes in particular, take years and years and years to design. There has to be a cut-off point. In terms of incentivisation, I don't think we've got any disincentives. Absolutely, in our license and our business case and the government strategy, the RIS roads investment strategy, it's very clear that this is a desire and should be something that is the responsibility of National Highways. Also, very high up in our net zero carbon plan is the modal shift element. It's not, as I said before, not just modal shift, it's demand management as a whole. So we're looking at mobility hubs, transfer to bus and coach, remoding, retiming of journeys, reducing journeys, which should time with this as well. So all of those things are happening. Some of those things can't happen without designated funds. And I think the fund is around £1 billion or near £1 billion, not just for users and communities, but it's a lot of money, and we've nowhere near reached the limit of those funds yet. So I don't see that as being limiting at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Before I unpick Roger and Adam's, quite, well, not techie, very important things, but I need to get my head around them. I'm going to ask you to answer Tom Bogdanovich's question. Tom is from London Cycling Campaign. Could you give an indication of what proportion of your roads include protected cycle tracks, and what increase has there been since lockdown, and also what plans in terms of proportion do you have in future? And obviously excluding motorways, are there any kind of targets for the delivery of segregated cycle roads? And actually I would also say, thinking about certain A roads, segregated footpaths as well. Do you have targets? And are you meeting?
We don't have targets for segregation. I did refer to the fact now segregation is in our standards, so where possible you make sure that we have segregation. It's not always possible, and I think for that reason it's too difficult a thing to have a target. We are working with DFT to come up with, in terms of a metric, we're looking at metrics generally. That isn't one that's on the table at the moment, but just to comment on metrics. Metrics are also quite difficult. It's difficult to have a rate-based metric because we don't actually know the number of users on our cycling network. So we are working with DFT very closely to look at what metrics we could have in place in future. I think you also mentioned numbers of people during and COVID impact. We do have a lot of data on COVID. I don't have it to hand, majority of which is on obviously road and freight users, but I think we may have some information on which probably aligns to other people's information about the increase in walking and cycling in particular.
Okay.
I'm sure that I've answered that as best I can. Really, we don't have a report. I don't have a report.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, it's useful to us to know, even though it's not great that, you know, that there are no targets. So that's possibly something we can pick up as politicians. I mean, even the national, you know, in the national policy has basic targets for cycling and for walking. The walking one was terribly easy to raise, but at least it was there. And you know, having targets, even if starting from a low base, is not bad. You know, so it's quite a useful thing to have. Right. Now, were you answering Roger's question about CD 95 that can only apply to the scheme is solely for cycling and not if it's intended for pedestrians and equestrians, and can design worse than useless old style cycle tracks? And then Adam Tranter, why does the roundabout guidance CD 116 have so many layouts which feel really dangerous to many people walking and cycling? Why not push for more grade separation than really complex roundabouts with multiple lanes to cross, which are rarely favoured by cyclists and pedestrians because of the sheer time it takes to cross? I mean, there's good practice in other countries. Is it not possible for using, you know, using good examples? So, yeah. So Roger's got examples of really poor crossings, particularly in east of England, and Adam's asking about thinking differently about roundabouts when LTN 120 has desirable standards and minimum standards.
Okay, so so we have, as I said, we've got 3 standards. The first one is 142. That's around early engagement and stakeholder management, and making sure that schemes consider what to put into their schemes. We've then got, as you mentioned, 195 and 143. And 143 certainly considers walkers, cyclists and horse riders. And 195 is about cycling. So between them all, they align with LTN 120 in those areas. The 116 geometric standard to roundabouts, I don't have that in front of me, and I suspect it's a geometric standard mainly targeted at road users. So I don't know when that's going to be refreshed, but it is, I'm not sure I would include so much in there with regard to, in the future, with regard to grade separation, for example, walkabouts, horse riders. We might be able to do that in one of the other standards that I've already talked about. And I have already said that we are committed to, when they come up for renewal in the next few years, we will build in the things that are missing from LTN 120 and give them due consideration to see how applicable they are for us. But I think ideas and thinking differently around grade separation is absolutely great. And it's about, probably not for standard, but almost for guidance to get our design teams to think about that. You know, we don't rule out LTN 120, we just consider it on a case-by-case basis because of our own standards. Yeah. So I'll take the 116 standard about roundabouts away. I'll have a look at it.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, obviously we've got attendees who have been deeply involved in specific schemes, because we've also got Martin Bolt from Kirklees Council and West Yorkshire and the Office of Mark Eastwood MP saying, you know, you've got what appears to be a bad design on the A628 Woodhead Pass, but on highlighting the faults around cyclists hanging midway, the response from National Highways was to put cyclist dismount signs, which, you know, seems unacceptable. And then Adrian Lord amending CD 143 so that, oh gosh, sorry, this is, am I allowed to use the word anorak? It does not excuse designers from meeting the standards in CD 195 when it comes to crossing side roads, major junctions, etc. National Highways designers use the excuse that this is shared use, so CD 195 doesn't apply. This is not the intent or fact. Adrian Lord is in fact a co-author of CD 195, so he does know what he's talking about, even if I don't. I hope that the recent amendments to GG 142, so anything to do with horses, helps to emphasise this too. Can I suggest that contributors here, we possibly, with Adam Kaufman, pool all these comments together and get a note to Frida to pass to her design colleagues. Although I am assuming that each of you with your expertise are also writing directly to National Highways. I'm going to go back to more of a policy question. I can cope with these. Any plans for installing park and cycle or park and scoot, where there are rental schemes, of course, facilities on the edge of urban areas, or encouraging more motorists to take the final mile on foot?
Yes. The actual cycle, hire of cycles, if that was the case, that would be absolutely not within our remit. But what is in our remit, which is I briefly mentioned earlier, was what we call mobility hub. So we are doing some research right now and trying to identify a couple of locations where we can work closely with local authorities, where we are going to look at hubs, even if they are small hubs, rather than this sort of all multi-functioning hub where buses and coaches, everyone comes to that point. So an enhancement of park and ride. So we've been heavily involved in park and ride for many years, and have actually funded through Designate funds some work on park and rides. But this is the next step. We call them mobility hub. You probably might have heard them called other things. And part of that would absolutely be anything related to active travel to encourage that last bit of the journey on walking or cycling, I guess.
Oh, sorry, what you're saying is it would link up with cycle hire and scooter hire.
Yes, it would have to. Yeah, absolutely.
And design properly designed routes for those modes from the park into the destination. And also walking and each segregated.
Yes.
Yeah.
We don't have locations yet. We're still looking at it, but we do have existing park and rides. We might be able to develop those sites further, or we might be able to work with local authorities who've already identified some sites that they want to do this. And if they're close to our network, we absolutely want to play our part in that. Yeah, we're very keen on this area, but it is early days. That's all I will say.
Okay, I'm going to go on to Caroline Nash's question. Caroline from Jacobs, and she's their walking, cycling and horse riding assessor. The web tag process for preparing the business case for new schemes doesn't appear to value all users' time equally. Reducing congestion for motorist time is costed, but increased time for pedestrians to use a bridge not on the desire line is not costed. In the interest of levelling up and equality, are National Highways challenging this with DFT and frankly having a somewhat more modern approach to the way the web tag process is currently assessed?
I would have to talk to my colleagues on that. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard that we are, but I may not be aware of something, so we'll need to take that one away if you don't mind.
Okay, and thank you, Adam Tranter, for another less nerdy question. Hang on, I haven't read it yet. It's for me to judge. How can you improve the knowledge and the knowledge and skills of National Highways engineers to design for cycling? Some local authorities have had specialist training from active travel experts, or are you waiting for the new organisation that the DFT is promising us? What are your thoughts about best practice, given that seems to be quite the gist of quite a lot of the questions?
So once the standards were updated a couple of years ago, what we then did was I effectively interpret them for our own staff. So we provided guidance, that's internal guidance documents in several of the areas to help our colleagues interpret and those design standards. And this is quite a common approach. We do it for a number of standards, doesn't matter what subject area. And what we then follow up with is a series of training sessions to introduce that guidance and introduce the standards. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but it's about to happen towards the back end of this financial year. Yeah. So yes, we're very, there's a parallel here with roadworks actually. So we do the same with roadworks and upskilling our own people. So they have, so obviously a lot of our work and the schemes is designed by others and designed by our supply chain. But if we don't have the right project managers with the right skills, they can't interpret whether something is good or bad. So it's about upskilling our own people to understand enough. They're not all specialists, but enough to interpret those design standards and understand what's good and what's bad.
And I think the other part of that question was, do transport engineers, do engineers in this space talk to each other between local authorities and national highways?
Yes, I suppose national highways might have, because we're so big, less engineers, more project managers, which is why it's so important to upskill some of our people. I'm an engineer, but we're not all engineers. But there are some really good examples, as I said earlier in my presentation, where and I had to read out the case studies, some really good case studies where we're working close with Nottingham, actually, really close with Nottingham, and in the northeast, although it did worry me slightly that Kirklees and Woodhead Pass was mentioned, because that should have been one of the good ones, but actually, yeah, that may be further.
And the other people to talk to, to engage are the local cycling groups, because they are often, they're usually called in by local authorities. So there's an awful lot of good knowledge there, and they share knowledge between themselves. And as I say, we hope that the government, the Department for Transport, is going to pool all this knowledge together, because we've lost 10 years of good practice sharing since the demise of Cycling England, I think it was called. We've now got to 25 past. I'm sorry we haven't answered all the questions, but I hope, Adam Kaufman, you can pool the questions, and particularly Adam Tranter, Roger Geffin and others with the techie questions, because there's obviously some useful learning there. And I will hand over to Darren Henry to very kindly close the meeting. And thank you, everybody, and thank you very much, Frida, for your very useful contribution.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that. Certainly, I think this cycling and walking APPG has done some really great work, which is why I want to be part of it as a vice chair. But thank you to Ruth Cadbury for chairing this group, and Adam Kaufman for his work busy in the background. Also, I must say that, following their fantastic report for the APPG released for suggestions for CWIS 2. So what I'd like is that we all continue to promote those aspects to government, businesses and individuals, so we can declare how important it is to support active travel. Today, very thankful to the speakers today. Andrew Salou, former chair, as I understand, coming back to ask 2 or 3 questions of our other guest. And that is Frida Rushdie, Head of Customer Journeys at National Highways. So thank you to both of those. Andrew, in his comments, talked about using the car less, and I think that's a key mantra that we want to achieve. I know that in my constituency, there was a plan for a scheme, which I was full on. Let's do cycling. Put some barriers on the road that would only allow cycling and walking to happen, and then there was half the community who just wanted to be able to have their cars not impeded at all. And so it just became a sort of an us and them divided issue. I think by saying what we would like to do is just have people use cars less, I think is quite a palatable way of saying it to people, rather than, you know, we just got to get on our bikes and you know, and stop using our cars. So and I do agree with that. Andrew also mentioned that he's pleased to actually see that with National Highways introducing new links now. So the plan for the A6, I think, to the M1 link will have a cycle lane next to it, something that is not seen before in previous schemes. So we are moving forward. We need to be positive that we are getting on and getting somewhere. So from Frida from National Highways, what I picked up on the early comments that you made is that RIS 1 2015 to 2020, we're now on to RIS 2 2020 to 2025, with double the amount actually put in by the government. So we're now on to £27.4 billion, double the amount of RIS 1. So what we will use that for was talked about. So the plans there. Part of that was work ongoing with designated funds. For example, that Rishda used was the restoration of the Keswick Trail, which is working on pilots with local authorities, and made the point that, you know, more likely to get approval if it is co-funded. So it's just something to think about on that as well. The key point, I think, if I'm right, that Frida was trying to make was that the National Highways have 3 key standards that they adhere to for all their schemes. And that's for cyclists, walkers and horse riders. And they are, you know, mandated to work with stakeholders on those 3 areas. There were some technical questions brought in, for example, the roundabout guidance, and a few other questions like that were posed. From the chair, I think that, you know, the best way forward on that is for those to be put into Adam Kaufman, pull those together as a bank of questions to ask Frida, and then we get a response back, and then maybe we can get a readout at the next meeting on that. So thank you very much for coming. Our next meeting will be held on Monday, the 29th of November at 4 p.m. And that will feature Andrew Stephenson, who is the HS2 Minister. So thank you very much, everybody.